Good afternoon. I have to admit that it's a bit different being up here looking out at my professors turned colleagues. I have to admit that I am indebted to them for stealing me away from the College of Engineering and Architecture at Tuskegee University over to the College of Arts and Letters, and especially to Dr. Barbara Baker, who introduced me to Albert Murray for the first time. The year 1970 marks an era of transition in the United States, specifically speaking of the American Civil Rights Movement and Black nationalism. It also marks the year Albert Murray publishes his inaugural book, The Omni Americans, Black Experience in American Culture. No description on the events that influenced Murray to write The Omni Americans is more explicit than his own words. The essays, commentaries, and reviews out of which The Omni Americans has been built are all intended as counterstatements and restatements in the generic sense. To race-oriented propagandists, whether white or black, the title of course makes no sense. They would have things be otherwise, but the United States is in actuality not a nation of black people and white people. It is a nation of multicolored people. There are white Americans, so to speak, and black Americans. It's not trivial to note that the subtitle on the cover of The Omni Americans differ from that within the text itself. As you open the first couple of pages, it reads, "Some alternatives to the folklore of white supremacy," and it articulates Murray's polarizing counterstatement to make clear delineations between blackness and whiteness. Though Murray reiterates race as black and white, he also acknowledges the United States as a nation of multicolored people and continues in his trademark brusque fashion saying, "But any fool can see that the white people are not really white and that black people are not really black. They are all interrelated in one way or another." Thus the title, The Omni Americans, is among other things an attempt to restate the problem formulated by the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders by suggesting that the present domestic conflict and upheaval grows out of the fact that in spite of their common destiny and deeper interests, the people of the United States are being misled by misinformation to insist on exaggerating their ethnic differences, as is so often assumed, but the intrusion of such differences into areas where they do not belong. Ethnic differences are the very essence of cultural diversity and national creativity. Interesting here is Murray's repeated insinuation towards multiculturalism through cultural diversity, yet he somehow resists its full articulation through focusing exclusively upon blacks and whites. I suggest here that contrary to Murray's plain words, his ideas are not necessarily limited to whites and blacks. After all, one must remember the times and circumstances from which he is writing. In a newly desegregated America, of course, with all deliberate speed, people yet again reevaluated perennial questions concerning the so-called fundamental differences between blacks and whites, particularly questions of economic, educational, and social practices. Simply put, these issues add up to the question, why are whites different from blacks? Or why are they different? With the assumption that peoples of both races now have equal opportunities, yet empirically, blacks are dysfunctional. The Kerner Commission's conclusion of 1967 seems to meet Murray's approval, but Daniel Patrick Moynihan's The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, notoriously known as the Moynihan Report, received no mercy from neither Murray in 1970 nor scholars and intellectuals all the way up through now, the 21st century. Indeed, Du Bois's impeccably accurate prediction that race in the United States would be the most pressing issue in the 20th century seeps into the next, further validating Murray's The Omni Americans as a seminal text in contemporary discussions of racial issues. Murray's The Omni Americans boldly subverts polemics of racial authenticity by recuperating the trope of the mulatto in an American idiomatic identity. According to Murray, American culture, even in its most rigidly separated precincts, is patiently and irrevocably composited. It is, regardless of all the hysterical protestations of those who would have it otherwise, incontestably mulatto. Understandably, some may have an aversion to the term mulatto. After all, its etymology is rooted in white supremacist ideologies with an intended impact on racial identity, namely maintaining the purity of the white race and of white women by bastardizing, in some ways, interracial relationships. I believe by using mulatto unabashedly, well aware of its immediate circumstantial weight, Murray attempts to reinvigorate and recover the term from its original implications and thus make identity politics in the United States idiomatic in both how he acknowledges racial dialectics and also how we insert ourselves in the discourse. In an interview, Louise Edwards asked Murray to explain further how the Omni Americans came about within the political and literary climates of his time. Murray responds, "The Omni Americans had to do with what I thought was basic, that is, the question of identity and who these people were and how they saw themselves in the actions that they were participating in. So I wanted to define what it meant to be an American and how we fit into it, and I came up with the idea that we're fundamental to it. That you can't be an American unless you're part of us, just as you can't be an American unless you're part of them. I came up with the concept of a culture, that as a context makes for, literally and figuratively speaking, a mulatto culture." When Edwards later suggests the idea of an Omni America as a microcosm of an omni humanity, Murray agrees. Yes, absolutely. We're looking for universality. We're looking for the common ground of man. And what you've been doing when you separate the American from all that is you're talking about an idiomatic identity. So what you enter into to make sense of things, its patterns and variations in culture. What you find are variations we can call idiomatic variations, if you will. People do the same things, have the same basic human impulses, but they come out differently. Here, Murray is not necessarily opposed to difference. He would say, in fact, that diversity is actually what makes America recognizable as an emblematic amalgam of culture. The problem arises when, as he indicates in the introduction to the Omni Americans, accoutrements of blacks are unjustifiably illuminated in contrast to the expectations of a white standard, thus generating conclusions through assumptions, or, to repeat Murray, a folklore of white supremacy and a fake lore of black pathology. Anything that black people do is abnormal, he says. If it's good, it's still abnormal. Conscious of the Moynihan Report as a particular source of muddled discourse that marginalizes the black experience, he is certainly dismissive of critical gazes from those who occupy positions with the privileged ability to distort historic truths with empirical so-called facts, also often recognized as statistics. In accordance with preceding commentary on Murray, Beverly Bateman's interview, Albert Murray, Up-Tempo, or the Velocity of Celebration, considers the Omni Americans an appropriate counter-statement to both black separatism and also the misguided ethics of social scientists during Murray's time. He says, "It's the quality of the dialogue at a given moment. We can look at it as a jam session. When I wrote the Omni Americans, I took a voice, literally the mask of a piano player, and I said all these guys are blowing these solos and they've forgotten what the basic chords are. You know, what is the nature of humanity and experience? What is the nature of American experience? I want affirmation. The artist is concerned with the terms on which he will survive as a human being." The idea of literally activating the motif of the masked pianist is paradoxical in the pedantic sense that Murray is not actually jamming on a piano, but rather on paper in this case. Regardless, momentarily consider this tentative and improvised blues metaphor. Are these soloists, the Moynihans, the Limbaughs, the O'Reillys, or even the Batesons, the Joyners, or Smileys, curious about what the other is playing? Put another way, are they, if we can call them intellectuals, truly invested in the interest of the members of the marginalized sectors that they critique? Or is Murray's contestation of their professional analysis accurate? Regardless, the point of emphasis here is essentially the question of inclusiveness. And the idea of a Mulatto America is contingent upon comprehensive American participation. In other words, America can only be incontestably mulatto if its multiracial, multicultural inhabitants contribute to what we call American art in the same ways that we designate literature or music as American in origin. So how do these two, the artist and the intellectual, function individually, yet both bear upon an idiomatic identity? Still within his rendition of a blues motif, Murray explains, "The function of the artist is to create images or the musical equivalents thereof that are commensurate with the complexities and the possibilities of life in our time, whereas the intellectual, or the so-called thinking person, has a responsibility to formulate questions, issues, and definitions that adequately reflect the problems of the times and thus form a basis that adequate specialized technicians can build on. I take this to mean that just as Murray alludes to himself as an artist, and intellectuals must parallel the artist. After all, if the artist does not create art, there is nothing to critique. As he implies here, an idiomatic identity operates in similar fashion with a blues idiom by seeking to coalesce rather than polarize. Coalescence achieves a unity, though sometimes unstable, such as a Mulatto America, when people may reject either mulatto or America or American or both in their identity distinctions. Because the blues, as Murray describes it, is always fluid, and I am not unveiling his fully orchestrated blues statement here, I borrow a functional definition of the blues idiom from Houston A. Baker Jr.'s work in Blues Ideology in African American Literature, which claims to translate music of American junctures into practical scholarly benefits, and validate Murray's examples of the roles of intellectuals in the Briar Patch File, which I previously stated. Think of the blues as a guideline for living life in often unfavorable circumstances which persist effectively upon the souls of individuals. Like history books enforce the persistence of facts through print and generational collective consciousness. If Jim Crow racism terrorizes blacks in the first three-fourths of the 20th century, then glass ceilings and institutionalized forms of racism haunt the descendants of Jim Crow victims. And the blues during that time concerning racism then maintains relevance now because the struggle remains. Considering the functionality of blues idiom in this way complements Baker's personal objective and challenge to the reader, which is to do what you can to decode what Albert Murray so astutely refers to as the American and also. Of course, the blues idiom itself is incontestably American. Furthermore, and what is of great interest, particularly in this paper, is what are the components that make up the American and the also in Baker's challenge. The and also appears to be a subtle reference to America's status as incontestably mulatto, because as I've said before, mulatto is a stigma placed upon the products of miscegenation. And if whites interested in maintaining their racial dominance used it as a term to underscore the blackness in a racially ambiguous person, then how could the term American in Baker's citation of Murray mean anything other than white, while the also implicates all others? If America is incontestably mulatto, then of course so are its inhabitants and cultural capital also, and thus they are idiomatic in how Americans allocate and represent them. If idiom can be defined as the various forms of expression that are particular to a distinct nation, and those forms of expression include art forms such as music, art, language, and writing to construct narratives, I propose that the production of expression is culture, and the product is identity itself generated idiomatically. In other words, the production of culture is idiomatic in itself, and artists themselves inscribe identity before intellectuals or people presenting these papers or you participating with the presentations ascribe it. If the blues idiom is a universal statement, then what Edwards started with his Omni Humanity, concomitant with Murray's Omni America, certainly holds ground. Murray confesses, "I don't know of a more valid, reliable, comprehensive, or sophisticated frame of reference for defining and recounting heroic action than is provided by the blues idiom, which I submit enables the narrator to deal with tragedy, comedy, melodrama, and farce. Simultaneously, I hear the music counterstating when whatever tale of woe, or worse, the lyrics might present for confrontation as part and parcel of the human condition." He also validates improvisation as heroic action as a way of responding to traumatic situations creatively. In a strained attempt for synthesis without immersing too far in rhetorical aesthetics, I find that anyone who contributes to the production of culture, in Murray's terms, slays the dragon representative of chaos as a fact of life through improvisation, and the product of this process is indeed art. In an interview with Beverly Bateman, Murray expresses a personal fight with a proverbial dragon, and Bateman asks or says, "There's the dragon of political injustice," and Murray responds, "It's a challenge, it would seem to me. You know, I'm not primarily a political commentator. The hero concept can be translated into anything. Someone has to confront the political circumstances and spell them out. I was concerned about that sort of thing in my first book, The Omni Americans, because I saw misdefinitions and I knew that the policies for corrective action would be inadequate. Counterstatement does not have to be simplified into just protest or polemical protest. And then Bateman doesn't necessarily respond directly to that, but she sort of adds as a side. Murray's powerful counterstatement was an affirmative battle hymn sung against the misdirected shouts of black separatists and the inept moaning of social scientists. Ralph Ellison, among others, called the work indispensable, talking about Omni Americans again. Recalling art as a particular form of expression or idiomatic, I further suggest when the white supremacists contemplate some alternatives to the folklore of white supremacy, that subtitle, I guess I would name it, or whatever is the black equivalent to white supremacy, sure he will recognize that the black experience is not much different from the white experience. After all, who would disagree that members of all races want to survive as a human being with a reliable job, a home, competitive education for their children, good nutrition, and health? If the dialectical reification of race difference is the source of the chaos by triumphing over it, one can see that idiomatic identity is indicative of Murray's assertion that America is indeed incontestably mulatto. In theory, America is an ideal pragmatic representation of amalgamation. Ironically, the term mulatto itself only constitutes the union between two, a black person and a white person. Of course, Murray's theoretical Mulatto America presents a paradox in the face of a racially multifaceted one. But he recognizes that this is not his paradox alone. No one can deny, he says, that in the process many somewhat white immigrants who were so unjustly despised elsewhere not only discover a social, political, and economic value in white skin that they were never able to enjoy before, but also become color poison bigots. Indeed, an amazing number of such immigrants seem only too happy to have the people of the United States regard themselves as a nation of two races. And here Murray exclaims, only two. Many who readily and rightfully oppose such antagonistic categories as Gentile and Jew gleefully seize upon such designations as the white people and the black people. And here Murray capitalizes white people and black people as if their nationalities are something beyond the myth that is race. But even as they struggle and finagle to become all white by playing up their color similarities and playing down their cultural differences, they inevitably acquire basic American characteristics, which is to say, Omni American. Contextually, Murray refers to Irish, Italian, Jewish, and other peoples who have historically faced ethnic conflict after their immigration to the United States early in the 20th century. He goes further in insinuating that they passed into the collective term white in order to assume the privileges that they could not acquire at quote-unquote home, to borrow a term from post-colonial discourse and in terms of exile and other things, home denoted by quotation marks. Particularly upward mobility, oftentimes at the cost of the denigration of quote-unquote black people. Though we often think of passing in terms of mulatto navigating the racial threshold, this type of passing deeply entrenches other types of minorities under the guise of whiteness. It is undeniable that racial dynamics in the United States are rooted in the black-white binary, but how do people who identify as both in an era where the one-drop rule is somewhat obsolete, or neither white nor black, fit into the mulatto American paradigm? Returning to Murray's attempt to revamp the term mulatto in an idiomatic sense, this nuanced usage expands to incorporate those who feel or attempt to place themselves outside of the black-white binary, and even to amplify its effect upon those who would think otherwise, to reverberate Murray, such as non-Anglo-Saxon immigrants who wish to merge or pass for white so that they too can feel their blackness. Remember that idiomatic identity is unifying through the blues idiom. As long as an American of any lineage creates art, which can be as simple as a journal according to the archival scholar, travel narratives, or even so-called intellectual, then they too contribute to an idiomatic identity. Now, searching for practical examples of idiomatic identities or omni-Americanness for the sake of practical applications, I turn to the art form of music. I do this keeping in mind Murray's treatise of universality, and the efforts toward achieving this in America becomes idiomatic due to the various ways in which Americans pursue sameness. However, in the following example, I find that idiomaticity itself denotes the type of difference that underscores separatism rather than universality. I choose rhythm and blues, or R&B, as an appropriate contemporary venue to demonstrate Murray's idiomatic identity as a derived, descendant genre of the blues that Murray and other contributors to American culture discuss. Of course, no offense to Dr. Baker, or as she may be aware, because she does do the blues thing, it can be said that it has been dominated nearly exclusively by black artists throughout its existence. But within the past decade, the genre has seen several successful white artists break through. Justin Timberlake, Robin Thicke, and Nelly Furtado are three big names that have appeared high on the Billboard top R&B charts during some point in their careers. Fascinatingly, two of these artists are also known for their success in other genres. Timberlake's participation in the boy band NSYNC is common knowledge, and as for Furtado, she is noted for her pop and folk sound from her albums Whoa Nelly in 2000 and Folklore in 2003. But through Timberlake's Justified 2002 and Future Sex Love Sounds in 2006, and Furtado's Loose in 2006, and Thicke's Breakthrough, the evolution of Robert Thicke in 2005, and I say that it's breakthrough because Robert Thicke has actually been invested in at least soul, if not R&B, for some time. They have shown that white artists can legitimately practice in the jam sessions that Murray talks about in Albert Murray, Uptempo, or the Velocity of Celebration, on the nature of humanity and American experience. They are not the soloists or so-called social commentators whom Murray takes offense. Instead, they contribute their idiomatic variations of lyrically conjuring the complexities of human life, including struggle and triumph, heartbreak and love. Using the terms legitimate or even authentic is a problem with itself. After all, Murray himself talks extensively about the differences between fine and folk art in Briar Patch File. But even within the tropes of Omni Americanness and idiomatic identification, which passively yet continuously pursue unity, there are still territories which remain impassable to some without a quote-unquote navigator. Conscious of how many middle-class blacks and whites feel about BET, and I anticipate eye rolls and sighs and these sorts of things when talking about something like BET. I point to it because, unlike a similar network, MTV, BET fails to feature genres of music dominated by white artists, such as rock and alternative, while MTV does not discriminate. Granted, the primary focus of BET is supposed to be black audiences, it now appears that because Timberlake, Thicke, and Furtado invest their work in a predominantly black genre of music, their productions are allowed to appear on a predominantly black network. And Timberlake and Thicke have even appeared to perform for live audiences during BET and Soul Train award shows. Certainly appearing on BET is by no means the definitive marker to denote Omni Americanness. However, these white artists are in many ways validated in the R&B genre through their collaboration with the likes of the Neptunes or Pharrell and Timbaland. However, it is at this juncture that I indicate the precariousness of accepting concepts of collective identities wholesale. Besides money, what influences MTV's decision to represent musical cornucopia while BET fails to do the same? If answers narrow down to the distinction between white folks in music and black folks in music, as I often hear people say even today, then even considering Murray's meta-inclusive, omni-American statement about Americanness, there is a concurrent resistance to it. For the R&B contributions of white artists are asterisked to not merely the black recognition of, but the jovial approval of derivatives of their art. I think that is not by mere coincidence as the genre of neo-soul, or the transcendent expression of the experiences that Murray talks about in the blues idiom itself, practically exclusive to black artists, has risen to the fore alongside the emergence of white R&B artists within the same time frame. It is as if blacks are willing to acknowledge that whites can jam too, but not like blacks do. We have seen this before with the dialectics of folk tales, Dialectics and Folktales, of Joel Chandler Harris and Thomas Nelson Page, juxtaposed with those of Paul Lawrence Dunbar and Zora Neale Hurston. But in this way, oddly, these dynamics represent a sort of subverted minstrel where whites perform like blacks, but with black endorsement. Nevertheless, recapitulating one of the primary purposes for writing the Omni Americans, I reiterate Murray's claim. Ethnic differences are the very essence of cultural diversity and national creativity. Even in the beginning stages of Murray's writing career, the seminality of the Omni Americans establishes the permanence of his contributions to American literature in general, and perhaps his concern for the human condition and his acquiescence to an omni-humanity could serve as the initial impetus for an idiomatic identity that expands beyond American borders and nearly exclusively Western ideologies and epistemologies, even if we are aware of the persistent, though conquerable, subliminal influence of racialist sentiment. Thank you.